Chapter 12. Claridge's Hotel, London, England, May 29, 1889. William Lowenthal was not used to London weather. Having spent the last few years in increasingly tropical and humid environments, most recently the heart of the Congo River, the brisk weather which lingered in the air in the early days of the English summer felt uncomfortably cold on his skin. It wasn't an unpleasant feeling. He had always preferred the cold, in truth. It was simply unfamiliar. Will wasn't sure how long he was planning to stay in England, exactly. He knew his own skills would do little to help Ray's condition. There wasn't much a cartographer could do to give medical assistance, other than a few folk remedies and snippets of natural medicine he'd learned from the various cultures he'd visited, but he doubted those would be useful in such a bizarre case as this. Still, it didn't feel right to just up and leave so soon after his arrival, while Ray was still on death's door and everyone was caught up in their panic, preparing themselves for the worst. He would be forced to stick around for a while regardless. Finding a way back to the Congo was proving about as difficult as he expected. He had abandoned his own private steamship, the Lilac Mask, which was still halfway up the Congo with the rest of his hired crew, under the leadership of his first mate, Amri. Until he could return to it, Will would have to rely on whatever transportation he could find, and, as is always the case when one is in desperate need of transportation, there was none to be found. Will shivered as he paced around his lavish hotel room. Despite the fire burning excitedly beside him, a distinct chill crept through the windows as the sun finished setting over London, staining the smog-filled air in vivid, blood-red hues. Will felt something on the back of his neck, tickling just above his collar. Used to mosquitoes and other feasting insects, he swatted at it, but found nothing. Just that odd feeling. That feeling of a presence, something behind him breathing down his neck and tracing fingertips along his spine. Something cold. Will wished, not for the first time since his arrival, that he had been in possession of more clothes suited to the cool weather. In actual fact, he did own them, they simply weren't here. For the most part, they were scattered across properties and continents, waiting to someday be unearthed again in the dusty closets of retired cabins, or sitting in boxes in the basement of friends or associates. When most of your life is on the move, your belongings tend to become a little scattered. He thought for the first time in a while of his real home, his old family property here in England. Will wondered vaguely if he even had any worthwhile belongings stored there, other than a vast collection of very intricate maps, of course. A flicker of movement in the corner of the room caught Will's attention. The cartographer spun around on his heel to face the windows that looked out over the city, only to find nothing. The room was empty apart from himself, just as it had been before. It was a trick of the light, perhaps. An issue with the gas lanterns that hung from the walls, filling the room with a hazy golden light. Or perhaps it was a reflection of the fireplace in the glass of the windows. Yes, just a reflection in the windows, Will thought to himself, smirking. Just the windows. Will stared at the windows, blinking rapidly as if what he was seeing now was merely something caught in his eye, a loose eyelash or speck of dust that he could blink away. Except that whatever he was looking at didn't change. Frost was beginning to inch along the edges of the glass, sprawling in crystalline patterns and stretching in intricate pathways across the plains. Such a thing should have been impossible. It was summer, after all. Even if it was cold by Will's standards, it was far too warm for ice to be forming. Despite this, however, the layer of ice now filled the entire window, and Will forced himself to move towards it, stirring his shocked body into movement. He reached out a hand, gently touching his fingers to the glass, and felt the cold seeping into his skin. A large shape moved on the other side of the window, obscured by the layer of frost. Will jerked backwards with a shout of surprise, knocking into a chair as he went. It was far too big to have been a bird, and moved far too slowly. It was a person. Will was sure of it. Someone had moved outside of his window. Ordinarily, while alarming, this would not have been altogether strange. The only issue with this conclusion, however, lay in the fact that Will's hotel room was situated several stories above the ground. Grasping behind his back for a fire poker, Will gradually built up the courage to approach the window once again. He had faced much worse things than the shadow and some unusual ice. He was William Lowenthal, damn it. He had survived jungle. He had wandered Arctic plains with only the pack on his shoulders. He had traversed the empty frontiers of the United States on horseback, and he was not going to be scared of a shadow. Except he was. As much as he tried to deny it to himself, Will was scared on a level that he couldn't fully explain. On a level that he shouldn't have been. There was nothing to be scared of. He knew that, of course. He was being foolish. Will's rationality waned, and he hesitated as he neared the window. Somewhere in the back of Will's mind, his subconscious was screaming. It was the part of the human brain locked away and ignored since childhood that tells you that you should be scared of the dark. The part of the brain that believes in fairy tales and ghost stories and evil creatures lurking behind trees. The part of the brain that believes there are monsters in the closet, simply waiting for the lights to go out before they feast on your bones. The part of the brain that, as much as we might try to ignore it, is right. Will continued to ignore the sensation of panic, swallowing the fear that bubbled and pressed at the back of his throat, choking him slowly. The ice had begun to melt now, giving a pocket of clarity with which he could look out into the street below. Will threw open the window, his knuckles white around the curled iron of the fire poker as he peered into the gloom. There was no one there. Of course, there was no one there. It was impossible for someone to be that high up and to move so quickly without a large enough windowsill or balcony to stand on. He was simply being childish, that was all. His tiled mind reverting to a jumpy, heightened state of paranoia, stirred on by his stressing over Ray's condition. Will tried to assure himself of this, but the notion failed to calm the goosebumps which stood to attention across his skin. Cautiously, Will leant out the window, placing his hands on the sill as he peered down to the street. It was far from empty. The streets of London were never truly empty, but it was quieter than it should have been. A few people still milled around in the distance, mostly drunks and police constables, the usual crowd for this time of night. The hotel was located on a fairly busy street. After all, there was bound to be some people. As he tried to calm himself, Will almost overlooked the lamppost. It stood on the corner of an alleyway not far below his window, the contents of the walkway just out of sight in the darkness. Except there wasn't darkness. The lamp burned bright and bold, distinctly brighter than all the others in the street, and it cast wild shadows on the walls of the alley, dancing angels and demons in the light of a bonfire trapped within the glass casing of the lamp. Squinting slightly at the lamp's brightness, Will noticed the figure standing beneath it. It took him a moment to place the features, obscured by the turned-up collar of a familiar coat. The figure almost looked like... Sherbet? Will breathed, trying to get a better view of the silhouette below. And then he blinked, and the figure was gone. Will continued to stare at the place where the person had been, his mouth hanging open. He knew there was someone there. He had seen them. He could even have pushed himself to believe that it was Sherbet, although the figure's height and stature were so unlike his friends that he was already beginning to doubt himself on that conclusion. And yet no one could have moved so quickly as to have disappeared entirely from view in the time it had taken Will to merely blink. The clothing was identical to that belonging to Sherbet, Will could have sworn, but... No, perhaps it wasn't. Will was viewing the figure from a distance, after all, and from beyond the blinding light of the lamppost. His eyes were deceiving him. In the moments he had seen them, the figure had seemed almost immaterial, flickering in time with the light itself, distorted through the misty haze of the night. More than likely there had never been anyone in that alley at all, and Will had simply imagined the whole thing. It was just some form of strange, stress-induced hallucination. His attempts at rationalizing the vision did little to calm his nerves. He could have sworn that just for a moment before they disappeared, when he was staring down at the figure, that they had been staring directly back up at him. Will remained at the window, staring down into the shadows. He peered into the alleyway as the street lamp dimmed to the usual steady glow. There was no sign of the figure, no shadow stretching beyond the street's entrance, and no movement behind the blinding light. He released a slow, unsteady breath. It was nothing. There was no one there. Will slowly closed the window, making sure to hear the soft click as it latched shut. The glass was slick with the condensation from the melted ice. The explorer didn't notice the cold, now locked inside the room with him, seeping through his clothes. At least, not until he could see his breath rising in front of his eyes, the steam curling from his lips. He'd let all the hot air out, he thought distantly. It was as simple as throwing some more logs on the fire, that was all. And then Will felt it. The wall of heat so thick and stifling it almost knocked him forwards, it slammed into his back. Will could feel it radiating over him in waves as every source of light in the room behind him suddenly burned brighter, flooding the room with a blinding explosion of soundless light, so harsh that even turned towards the wall he had to squeeze his eyes shut. Will wheeled around, squinting against the brightness. Columns of flame rose from the glass casings of the gas lamps, and flames licked high and hungrily from the fireplace, clawing at the mantel. A midsummer bonfire raging within the wall, spilling heat into the room. A shadow moved through the flames, and Will raised a trembling hand to shade his eyes, which watered in protest with the sudden dryness of the air. Who's there?" Will yelled over the deafening roar of the flames. The flames went out, all of them simultaneously extinguished. None of the metal lamp fixings glowed with heat. Not a single ember smouldered in the hearth. The room was plunged into complete darkness, even the lamplights outside failing to bleed into the gloom. Will floated in the black void, his burning, aching eyes straining to latch onto something, anything around him. He failed to find anything in the blackness. "Sherbet? Is this you? I saw you in the street. Is this one of Easton's practical jokes? Whoever you are, it's not funny. This isn't funny." Will's voice cracked as he shouted. Something moved in the room across from him. Will couldn't see it, of course. He couldn't see anything. But he could feel it. He could feel the way the air moved about the thing's large form. Hear the shuffling, scraping sound as it dragged its immense weight across the floor. Will took a step back, pressing himself against the wall. Except it shouldn't have been a wall. It should have been the window. The window was gone. It was impossible. He had been standing right in front of the window when the lights went out. His back, however, pressed up not against the windowsill and glass, but the flat, plastered wall of the hotel room. "I'm armed. I'm warning you right now." Will's grip tightened on the fire poker. He wondered, if he yelled loud enough, would somebody hear his cries? Another guest in one of the nearby rooms, or the staff of the hotel delivering something in the hall outside? Or would the blanket of shadow which had fallen over the room only muffle the sound of his screams? Over the heavy beating of his heart in his ears, Will swore he heard something. A shifting of cloth, or maybe a voice. The hairs stood up on the back of his neck yet again, chills spreading across his entire body. Who's there?" he breathed, trying to stop his teeth from chattering from the fear and the sudden onslaught of that impossible cold once again. The sound came again. A whisper, dry and husky like fingers scraping across dried parchment, or the crackling of charcoal in a fire. It spoke directly into Will's ear, and he could feel the cold breath of whatever was there tickle the back of his neck, brushing past his earlobe in the darkness. Therapy. Will jumped, throwing his body away from the voice and swinging the poker. There was a crunch as the metal sunk into the plaster of the wall, missing its target, if indeed its target had ever been there to begin with. The cartographer crashed to the ground, off balance, scrambling backwards on his hands and scuttling into the center of the room, losing both the fire poker and the grounding presence of the wall. He was lost, adrift in the sea of darkness. His movements echoed in the silent room, The only other sound which joined the empty symphony his frantic, ragged breathing. The whisper came again, this time from all directions, an incomprehensible string of foreign syllables and words which felt like needles piercing Will's ears as they burrowed into his mind, prying and picking and stabbing at his soul. He collapsed fully to the ground with a cry of pain which caught in his gasps of breath. Will rolled onto his side, pressing his hands to his ears in an attempt to block out the sound. He could feel something slick and warm between his fingers, becoming sticky as it dried beneath his fingernails. Sweat from the intense heat that had momentarily filled the room. Blood from the inside of his ears, hemorrhaging from the words which tried to force themselves into his skull. He understood none of their meanings. They were merely sounds. Deafening, painful sounds. Despite the pain they caused, however, Will felt in his chest that there was no intent to harm hidden behind the words. It was as if the realization were impressed upon him, pulling him from a rope anchored around his ribs. The words were not malicious. They were merely wrong. The wrong words for his ears, the wrong voice for this world. There was no other way he could describe them. The language was wrong. Despite tears rolling down his face and the seemingly endless well of pain he had been dropped into, Will's body was flooded with a sense of comfort. The soft, warm emotion of the non-existent speech soaked from the darkness into his heart. Comfort, understanding, apology, even. For a brief moment, Will could have sworn he felt a hand gently rest on his shoulder, and he instinctively jerked his body away. He curled his legs up to his chest, shivering from the cold and the pain, muttering prayers incoherently as the warm tears flooded down his face, steaming unseen in the freezing room. "Please," he whispered into the darkness. "Please stop." He squeezed his eyes closed again in the darkness and prayed that this would end. Even if he died, at least it would end. Will could feel the presence creeping forward, coming closer and closer. Soon it would reach him. This was where he was going to die. Will could feel it, death wrapping him in its icy embrace, the painful words merely the lamentation of the angels beyond the veil. He wasn't ready to go. He didn't want to die, not like this. The gentle knocking on the door of the hotel room was so loud that Will screamed in fright. His eyes flew open and he threw his body away from the sound. Will had expected to find darkness, or worse, perhaps the looming face of whatever had been in the room. Only instead he found nothing. The room was once again lit just as it was before. The fire crackled warmly and the gas lamps burned steadily, illuminating the space in soft, comforting golden light. The chair he had knocked into was back in its rightful place, and even the fire poker was returned to its holder beside the mantel, as if it had never been removed. The hole in the wall from where he had swung wildly in the darkness was nowhere to be seen. Will reached up a hand to his ears, expecting to find blood, but his fingers came away clean. It was nothing out of the ordinary. The only sign that anything had changed at all was a single blue candle, which burned happily on the mantelpiece above the fire where it had never been lit. The knocking at the door came again, and Will scrambled to his feet. "Who's there?" Will's voice was weak and shaky, and he tried to dry the tears from his eyes as he slowly approached the door. "Desk service," a young man's voice answered. "A letter was delivered for Master Lomenthal." Will opened the door a crack. A man in a hotel uniform stood awkwardly outside. "We would normally hold on to it till morning, sir, and we're very sorry to have woken you, but the deliverer stressed it was incredibly urgent." He handed the envelope to Will. Will took the envelope with an unsteady hand, and the man began to walk away. "Wait," Will said, grabbing the man's sleeve. "This person who delivered this, were they about this tall? Dark hair?" He indicated the height of the figure in the street, with the hand holding the envelope, releasing the hotel worker. "Why, yes, sir, they were." And their eyes," Will stressed, picturing the figure in the alleyway, which still sent a chill down his spine as if it weren't the most explainable thing that he had experienced tonight. He shook his head, guiding his thoughts towards Sherbet. Had it been them? Their eyes. Was one blue and the other a light brown, almost golden? The golden one may have been bleeding? Will asked. The worker looked confused. No, sir, not at all. Their eyes were sort of grey, I suppose. Both of them. The man paused. I know, 'cause they struck me as odd at first. Real shimmer and silver colour, like they were coins for eyes. You must be mistaken, sir. Will swallowed. His throat was dry. Perhaps it wasn't Sherbet outside after all. Yes, perhaps I was. He coughed, trying to gather himself. Could you please bring some cold water up to the room, if it's not too much trouble? The worker nodded. Of course, sir. Right away, sir. Thank you. Will closed the door softly, once again waiting to hear it click shut as he locked it. He leaned against the door, his heart still racing, and the letter becoming crushed in his hands. Will inspected the words on the front of the envelope. Urgent. Master Lowenthal. It was written in crude, strange handwriting, as if the writer of the letter was unused to the English script, unused to writing at all, placing the letters oddly, unsure of themselves. Carefully, Will slipped the letter open and read it to himself. The words were nonsense. The letter was nothing.